22 years. That's how long Nam Jieon-yu ruled the dark spine of South Korea without flinching. The White Tiger of Busan. The man whose name made police captains sweat and rival bosses pray. No one challenged him. No one survived trying. Then one night, inside a meeting worth $30 million, a dead phone vibrated. A phone nobody was supposed to know existed. 8 words on the screen. Please help. Bad men are hurting my mama. And the most dangerous man in Korea stopped breathing.
Hit that like button right now. Drop your city in the comments. I want to know where you're watching from tonight. Welcome to K-Drama Afro Tales. Let's go.
The rain had been coming down hard since 7 that evening. The kind of sideways Busan rain that found every gap in your collar and soaked through to the skin before you could button up. The port district smelled like it always did in October. Salt, rust, diesel exhaust, and the particular sweetness of rotting fish that no amount of commercial development ever fully chased away. The harbor lights wavered behind the storm, orange and white smears across the black water. And somewhere in the dark, a container ship's horn groaned like an animal in pain. Nam Jieon-yu sat at the head of a lacquered table on the 14th floor of the Busan Maritime Tower and said nothing. He had been saying nothing for 11 minutes. That was deliberate. Silence was the first weapon he'd ever mastered. Back when he was 17 years old and had nothing else to use against men twice his size. He'd carried it ever since. Around the table, 6 men in expensive suits waited on his answer. A Japanese syndicate representative, 2 mainland partners, 3 of his own lieutenants. They had all flown in for this meeting. They had all rearranged schedules and cleared weekends and kissed the rings that needed kissing to sit in this room. $30 million in consolidated shipping routes sat on the figurative table between them, a partnership that would cement Jieon-US control over 3 ports simultaneously and make the Biko syndicate untouchable for the next decade. He hadn't touched his tea. His hands were flat on the table, perfectly still. His face was the same stone face it had been since his 20s, angular and unreadable, the kind of face that photographers tried to capture and always failed. A scar ran from his left jawline toward his ear, the remnant of a knife fight in Mokpo when he was 23. He'd won. The other man had not. That was the whole story, and Jieon-yu had never felt the need to elaborate. Beside him, his head of security, Baek Sung-min, leaned in slightly and murmured, "Sir, the Japanese representative has a flight at midnight." Jieon-yu did not look at him. He was looking at the rain on the window. Something was bothering him. It had been bothering him for the last hour. A low-frequency unease sitting behind his sternum, like a coal that wouldn't quite ignite. He couldn't name it. He'd learned not to ignore that feeling. The last time he'd ignored it, he'd walked into an ambush in Incheon and lost 2 men before he got out. The time before that, he'd been 3 blocks from a building that collapsed on 12 people, and he'd been on his way there for a meeting that was later revealed to have been a setup. The feeling wasn't premonition. He didn't believe in anything that mystical. It was pattern recognition, his brain assembling a picture from 1,000 microsignals he hadn't consciously registered. Something in the texture of the night was wrong. His personal phone sat in his jacket's inner pocket. His personal phone never vibrated during meetings. He had a separate line for that, a clean number he gave to nobody except Sung-min and his accountant, and even they knew better than to use it without a code word first. The other phone, the old phone, had been sitting in the same jacket pocket for 3 years. He barely remembered it was there anymore. He kept it the way some men kept their father's watches. Not useful, not worn, just present. A weight that meant something he couldn't explain. It was that phone that vibrated. Jieon-US jaw tightened by a fraction. Nobody at the table noticed. Sung-min did, because Sung-min had been watching this man for 12 years and could read him the way a sailor reads weather. Sung-min said nothing. He waited. Jieon-yu did not reach for the phone immediately. He sat with the vibration like it was a physical shock to the system, something that needed absorbing before he could respond to it. That phone had 1 contact programmed into it, and that contact had been Chidi Nwosu, who was either dead or gone beyond the reach of anyone Jieon-yu knew. It had been nearly 4 years since anyone had heard from Chidi, and the last Jieon-yu had known, the man had essentially ceased to exist. The phone had never vibrated before in 3 years. He reached in and drew it out under the table, holding it below the edge so the men across from him couldn't see the screen. He looked down. 8 words. Please help. Bad men are hurting my mama. The handwriting, the font, the uncorrected lowercase, the period at the end where a child instinctively puts one because they learned to in school, told him everything about who had sent it before he even processed the message itself. A kid. Chitty had a kid. Jianyu knew that much. A daughter. He'd seen one photo years ago. A small girl with her mother's face and her father's eyes, sitting on a warehouse floor surrounded by steel scrap while Ojichukwu Nwosu welded something enormous in the background. Chitty had shown it to him with the kind of pride that even hard men can't keep off their face when they're talking about their children. Her name is Kayamika, Chitty had said. She's going to be an engineer, maybe a better one than her mother, which would be terrifying for the rest of us. The girl in that photo had been maybe 4 or 5 years old, so now she was 8, 9, old enough to type, old enough to know something was wrong and reach for the only emergency option her father had left her. Old enough to be in danger she couldn't handle alone. Jianyu stood up. The table went quiet in an instant. When Jianyu stood without warning, you went quiet. It was a conditioned response by now, like pulling your hand back from a flame. Gentlemen. His voice was level. It was always level. I need 48 hours. The Japanese representative blinked. I'm sorry. The agreement terms are acceptable to me. My team will confirm by Friday morning with the signed terms. Tonight is finished. He straightened his jacket. Sung Min will see you out. He was already moving toward the door. He heard one of his lieutenants start to say something behind him. Song Min-ho, who always thought he could say something. And Sung Min cut him off with a word so quiet Jianyu didn't catch it. That was fine. Sung Min had good instincts. That was why Jianyu kept him. In the elevator going down alone, Jianyu looked at the message again. He typed back a single line. Where are you? Stay hidden. The reply came in 40 seconds. Coordinates. A voice in his head that sounded uncomfortably like Chitty said, I built that phone so she could find you, Jianyu. If she's using it, it's real. The coordinates resolved in his memory before he even opened the map. Outer industrial edge of Busan. The stretch of dead land between the old Daehan Heavy Industries facility and the water. A wasteland of shuttered warehouses and obsolete dry dock infrastructure that nobody had found a commercial use for since shipbuilding had pulled back in the 90s. He knew the area. He'd moved product through it twice in the early years, before it became too exposed and too surveilled. It was the kind of place where someone could disappear completely if they wanted to, or where someone could be made to disappear completely if they didn't. He walked out of the building into the rain without an umbrella. His driver was waiting under the awning. Jianyu walked past him, opened the back door himself and said, Industrial Warehouse District, east of the old dock complex. I'll direct you from there. Sir, do you want? Drive. The city fell away behind them in wet streaks. The commercial zone gave way to the port infrastructure. The port infrastructure gave way to the dead industrial belt, and the streetlights became increasingly sparse until there were long stretches of road, where the only illumination was the headlights carving a white cone through the rain. Jianyu sat forward in his seat with his elbows on his knees, the old phone in his hands. He had not messaged the girl again. He didn't want to risk her looking at a phone when she was supposed to be staying down. He was not a man given to emotion. He'd had that systematically removed from him by 2 decades of operating in a world where sentiment was the first thing your enemies went for. He'd buried men he'd grown up with and said nothing at the funeral. He'd made decisions that kept him up at night exactly once, in 2009, after a night in Ulsan that he still didn't talk about, and after that he'd gotten very good at locking the door on that room inside himself and losing the key. What he was feeling now was not quite emotion. It was simpler and older. It was the feeling of a debt that needed to be paid. Chitty Nwosu had saved his life in 2018. Not in a dramatic, cinematic way. Not a bullet taken or a knife intercepted. Chitty had given him information that at the time had seemed like a minor favor in a mutually beneficial relationship between a man navigating South Korea's corporate infrastructure and a man navigating its criminal one. But the information had been correct, and the timing had been critical. Without it, Jianyu would have walked into a situation that would have cost him everything. Chitty had asked for nothing in return. He'd just nodded and gone back to the blueprints spread across the conference table in his wife's studio. And Jianyu had felt the specific discomfort of owing something to someone who didn't want payment. He'd offered one thing. If you ever need it, if Ojichukwu ever needs it, the number is programmed. You won't reach it any other way. Chidi had looked at him for a long moment. Then he'd said, I hope we never need it, Jianyu, but thank you. And then Chidi Nwosu had vanished from the world. Jianyu had learned through channels too oblique to trace back that Chidi hadn't died. That there had been something, evidence of something, a case being built against someone powerful. And Chidi had been folded into protective custody before anyone could get to him. But he'd never been told the details. He hadn't asked for them. Some things you left alone. He'd assumed Ojichukwu and the girl had gone with him. He'd assumed they were somewhere safe and distant, building a new life under a new name in a city that had no idea who any of them were. He had assumed wrong. Stop here, he said. The car stopped. He stepped out into the rain without a word to his driver, and the rain hit him immediately, soaking into his shoulders, running down the back of his neck. He stood on the cracked asphalt and looked down the service road that curved away into the dark, and he could see, maybe 300 meters ahead, the silhouette of a large industrial structure. A converted warehouse or fabrication facility, the kind of place that used to build ship components and now just held weather in silence. Except it wasn't holding silence tonight. He heard it even over the rain. A low, heavy impact, metal against something. Then voices, not words, just the cadence of command voices, men giving orders in the specific tight tone of professionals running an operation. And then, closer and much more distinct, the unmistakable sustained hiss of a welding torch being run at full pressure. Jianyu moved. He went off the road and across the broken ground in the dark, moving the way he'd learned to move decades ago, when there were no resources and no allies and the only advantage he had was the ability to reach a position before anyone expected him. He'd been wearing good shoes to a business meeting tonight. The rain had already destroyed them. He noted this the way he noted all things that no longer mattered, filed it away, moved on. He came around the eastern wall of the facility and stopped. 2 vehicles were parked at angles 50 meters ahead, SUVs dark, no plates visible in this light, the kind of vehicles professionals used when they wanted to look like nothing in particular. A man in tactical clothing stood between them with his back to Jianyu, talking into an earpiece. Beyond him, the main loading bay entrance of the building stood open, and through it came light, inconsistent, moving, the flicker of active torch work, not the steady illumination of overhead lamps. The man by the SUVs hadn't heard him coming. The rain was doing Jianyu a considerable favor in that department. He made a quiet calculation. He was unarmed, he didn't carry to business meetings, a policy he'd maintained for a decade because the paranoia of a meeting where everyone was armed was counterproductive, and because he'd learned to read rooms well enough not to need the fallback. He was alone. He had no intelligence on numbers inside. He didn't know the child's exact position. He didn't know Ojichukwu's status. None of that stopped him from moving forward. He went around the man at the SUVs and came at the loading bay entrance from the eastern angle, pressing himself against the corrugated metal wall and listening for 10 full seconds before he moved through the opening. What he saw inside was not what he had been prepared for. The interior of the warehouse was enormous, maybe 40 meters wide and 60 long, with a ceiling that vaulted up to the steel rafters at a height of 15 or 16 meters. The walls were lined with industrial equipment in various stages of completion: plasma cutters, hydraulic presses, steel bending rigs, a bank of industrial welding units on a rail system along the south wall. The floor was polished concrete stained with years of metalwork, and scattered across it were sculptures. Unmistakably sculptures, not industrial waste, massive steel figures and abstract forms that caught the emergency lighting and threw hard angular shadows up the walls. The woman had made this place extraordinary. Jianyu registered all of this in approximately 2 seconds, because the situation demanded immediate processing rather than appreciation. There were 4 men inside that he could identify immediately. 2 near the center of the floor, 1 near the back loading dock, 1 climbing the external ladder that ran up the eastern shelving rack toward the upper mezzanine. They were all armed. They moved with the specific economy of people who had done this kind of work before, people whose lives had stripped them of unnecessary motion. He did not see Ojichukwu Nwosu. He did not see the girl. What he saw instead was the welding torch mounted at the top of the rail system along the south wall, moving on its own, or not quite on its own, because someone had triggered the automated rail drive and it was traversing the full length of the wall at 3/4 speed, throwing a hard, focused arc of blue-white light that swept the room in a slow-moving bar. He understood immediately. She was using it as a distraction or a weapon or both. The man climbing the eastern rack ladder stopped and looked toward the torch rail. The two men in the center of the floor had both turned to track it. The man at the back dock was moving his head back and forth between the rail and the darker sections of the room, trying to establish a safe sightline. And in that brief moment of collective reorientation, a figure dropped from the mezzanine above the back dock. She dropped onto the man's back from approximately 4 meters, and the impact of a fully grown woman plus the overhead kinetic force drove him straight to his knees on the concrete. Jianyu heard the crack from where he stood. She wrenched the weapon from his hands in a motion that was more experienced than technique, raw, efficient, nothing elegant about it, and came up already moving. Nam Jianyu had encountered very few people in his life who could be called dangerous in the way that he was dangerous. In the next 5 seconds, he understood that Ojichukwunwosu was one of them. She moved through this space with an understanding of it that was total and almost architectural. She knew where the shadows fell, where the floor's surface changed, where the equipment would give her cover and where it would channel an opponent. She put one man down with a hydraulic press lever swung at head height. She drove another into the rail system and triggered the clamp mechanism. Jianyu heard the man's yell cut short and chose not to examine the physics of that too closely. The torch rail kept sweeping, the light kept swinging, and then she turned, weapon raised, and pointed it directly at Jianyu. "Don't!" Her voice was controlled in the way that only genuine rage allows. Everything stripped down to function, no room for anything extraneous. Her hands were not shaking. She was wearing a welding apron over work clothes, her natural hair covered by a cloth wrap that had come partially loose, and she was looking at him down the barrel with absolute clarity in her eyes. "I'm not one of them," Jianyu said. "You're wearing the same expensive suit and the same expensive shoes that every man who's tried to kill me tonight was wearing. Give me a reason." The girl sent me. A flicker. Not doubt. The opposite of doubt. Something worse. Something that meant this mattered too much. "How?" "Chitty left me a phone number 3 years ago. Emergency contact. She used it 40 minutes ago." The barrel did not drop. Ojichukwunwosu was looking at him with an expression that was doing several things at once. Calculating, disbelieving, needing to believe, refusing to let need make her stupid. "Chitty doesn't trust people like you. Chitty trusted me with one specific thing in one specific situation. He was right to. He let the rest of it hang where it was. Your other man is about to come through that loading bay. We need to move." She held the aim for another 2 seconds. Then she dropped it to her side. Not lowered it, dropped it. A choice that told him she was making a calculated gamble rather than a decision, and turned toward the deep shadow beneath the far mezzanine stairwell. Kayamika! A pause that lasted long enough for Jianyu's chest to do something he wasn't going to examine. Then a small figure detached itself from the shadow under the stairs. The girl was slight and serious, wearing a work vest several sizes too large for her over a school sweatshirt, her hair in 2 uneven braids. She had a tablet in her hands, an older model, cracked screen, running something that looked like a monitoring program from the facility's security cameras. She looked at her mother first, then at Jianyu, and her expression did the specific thing children's expressions do when they've been trying very hard to be brave and the adult they called for has actually arrived. "Uncle Jianyu," she said. Her voice was completely steady. "I knew you'd come." He didn't know what to do with that. He set it aside. "Good thinking with the phone." Then to Ojichukwu. "How many?" "I've put down 4 inside, 2 outside minimum. There's a man by the vehicles and at least 1 more I haven't accounted for." Her jaw was set. "There's a route through the north corridor to the old dry dock. I know a sublevel entrance to the drain tunnels." "How long has the rain been running through them?" "I've been living here for 7 months. I know which ones flood." She was already moving, positioning herself between Kayamika and the loading bay entrance. "You cover right. I know which side to cover." She glanced back at him, a brief sharp look that contained a full conversation. I don't know what you know. Don't act like we're partners. He met it without reaction. There wasn't time to establish trust. They both understood that. They moved. The man by the vehicles had heard the noise from inside and was moving toward the loading bay when Jianyu came through the side door in the north wall and met him at an angle. The exchange was brief. Jianyu had a height and weight disadvantage against a man with training and a firearm, and he neutralized the firearm first, which was always the priority, and the rest of it was ugly and close and finished in 12 seconds on the wet asphalt. He didn't feel the impact of the man's elbow across his ribs until he was already through the north corridor, but he felt it then. A hot bloom of pain on the left side that told him something had, at minimum, cracked. He said nothing about it. He kept moving. The north corridor was a long covered passage that connected the main fabrication floor to the outdoor handling area, and Ojichukwu moved through it with the girl close behind her, not running, but moving at the deliberately controlled pace of someone who'd learned that running made noise and panic made mistakes. Jianyu came in behind them and pulled the corridor's heavy steel door shut, throwing the interior into a darkness broken only by the pale green glow of emergency lighting strips at floor level. Left at the end, Ojichukwu said quietly. There's a floor hatch behind the third press unit. What are they looking for? What do they want specifically? Later. I need to know what I'm dealing with. You need to walk and let me think. She wasn't rude about it. She was efficient. There are things you don't have context for. The hatch was exactly where she said. It was heavy, rusted at the hinges, and took both of them pulling to open without making enough noise to carry. Below was a service shaft that dropped 3 meters to a concrete ledge above a drainage channel, the water running fast but shallow, maybe 30 centimeters, cold enough to ache the ankles immediately when they dropped in. Kayamika went down first, lowered by her mother with a grip that didn't waver. Jianyu went second. Ojichukwu came last, pulling the hatch shut above her with a move that required her to half-hang from the ceiling before dropping, landing clean, no sound. He looked at her in the green-tinged dimness. She was breathing hard now, not panicked the way athletes breathe hard, oxygen debt from exertion. The welding burns on her hands were old ones, calloused over, permanent topography on her palms and knuckles. The newer scrapes from tonight were bleeding at her left forearm, a long shallow cut she hadn't addressed and showed no sign of planning to. You're holding your ribs, she said. Yes. They looked at each other. Something settled between them. Not warmth, not anything that simple, just the acknowledgement of shared damage that neither of them was going to stop for. Which direction? He asked. Northeast. 300 meters. Then up through a pump station access. It's disused. I have supplies there. From there we can make real decisions. Kayamika had already started walking northeast through the channel, watching the water depth as she went, testing each step the way her mother had presumably taught her, calm and methodical, and 8 years old in a drainage tunnel in the middle of a rainstorm while men with weapons searched for them above. Something happened in the back of Jianyu's chest that he hadn't felt in a very long time. Not softness, harder than softness, something closer to recognition, the sight of a small person doing a terrible thing with extraordinary steadiness, and the involuntary response that produced in whatever remained of him that could still respond to things like that. He filed it away. He followed them northeast through the dark water and said nothing. The pump station was a concrete cube roughly 4 meters square, accessible through a shaft that Ojichukwu had fitted with welded iron rungs at some point in the past 7 months. Recent welds, clean work, she'd done it herself. Inside she had built a survival cache with the same methodical intelligence she apparently applied to everything. Waterproof containers with food, medical supplies, a change of dry clothes for each of them in rough sizes that made him understand she'd been thinking about scenarios where other bodies might be present, a compact radio scanner, and a series of notebooks that she swept into a waterproof bag the moment they were inside. Kayamika sat on a folded tarp and peeled off her wet shoes with practiced resignation. She dug a granola bar out of a container and began eating it in precise small bites, watching her mother move through the space with the attentive calm of a child who has learned that watching her mother closely is one of the most useful things she can do. Ojichukwu dressed the cut on her arm without asking for help and didn't offer to help Jianyu with his ribs. He taped them himself from the kit she pointed at, working his shirt up on one side in the dim lantern light, and if she noted the map of scar tissue across his torso, which she did, he saw it register. She made no comment. You should eat something, she said. Not a question. She slid a container toward him. Tell me about Jung Tae-ho, he said. The container stopped moving. He watched her face do a controlled reassembly, the way a structure redistributes weight when a main support shifts. Where did you get that name? Chitty mentioned it once 3 years ago. In passing. The kind of in passing that means the opposite of in passing. Ojichukwu looked at him for a long moment. Then she sat down, not across from him but at a right angle, so they were both looking at the wall rather than at each other, and she started talking. Jung Tae-ho had built himself into one of South Korea's most celebrated developers over 15 years, constructing commercial and residential towers across Busan, Incheon, and Seoul, towers that were beautiful and modern and photographed endlessly for architecture publications. He had government contracts, charitable foundations, a face that appeared on magazine covers with the specific expression of a man who had decided that looking thoughtful was better than looking powerful. The problem was the buildings. Ojichukwu's voice stayed flat and precise as she described it. She was a structural engineer. She didn't build things. She understood how things stood up. And she'd been contracted by one of Tae-ho's subsidiary firms 7 years ago to consult on a residential tower in the Swyong district. And what she'd found in the building's infrastructure had made her physically ill. Concrete mixed short on the aggregate ratios to cut material costs. Load-bearing columns poured thinner than the architectural plan specified. Fire suppression infrastructure installed on paper, non-functional in reality. A building in which 40 stories of inhabited structure was supported by a skeleton that met approximately 60% of the legal load requirements. She'd filed a report. She'd filed it through the correct channels, through the Municipal Engineering Office with copies to the National Safety Board. The report had been buried. The man she'd filed it with had received a significant sum of money and a job offer in that order. Ojichukwu had then hired a lawyer. The lawyer had withdrawn from the case within a week, declining to explain why, and had subsequently moved his family to Jeju. Chitty, who understood corporate infrastructure the way Ojichukwu understood steel, had started tracing the money that had bought the silence. The trail had grown. It became, over the following 2 years, a map of corruption that reached into 5 municipal governments, 3 national regulatory bodies, and the personal financial networks of people who had political careers worth protecting. There are people living in those towers right now, Ojichukwu said. Her voice had not changed pitch or pace throughout. I know how many. I've kept track. How many? 11 residential buildings across 3 cities. Total occupancy approximately 4,000 people. She paused very briefly. When Chitty disappeared, I understood that Tae-ho's people knew we'd been investigating. I also understood that if I ran, if I took Kayamika somewhere safe and kept our heads down, the investigation died. The evidence died. The building stayed up. She turned her head slightly toward the girl, who was still eating her granola bar and making no show of not listening. So you stayed, Jianyu said. I have everything. 7 years of documentation, structural reports, financial records, witness statements from contractors who were threatened into silence. Everything is hidden in a way Chitty and I designed together before he went. Tae-ho's people believe the critical evidence is encoded in. She stopped. In me. Her chin came up slightly. There's a rumor I put out through controlled channels 2 years ago that the evidence files are encrypted with biological keys. That you'd need me to access them. The tactical intelligence of this registered immediately. Which is why they need you alive. Which is why they haven't simply killed you. For the first time, something crossed her expression that wasn't analytical composure. A thin edge of exhaustion, not physical but foundational, the weariness of someone who has been making every single decision correctly for years and is tired of how much effort correct decisions require. The scars. They think the decryption keys are encoded in the scarring patterns on my skin. They were told that. By you. He looked at her hands, the welding scars. And they're not. No. Where's the actual evidence? She looked at him for a long moment. The lantern made the shadows angular and deep, and he could see Kayamika watching both of them over the granola bar wrapper. Dark eyes taking everything in and storing it. I'll tell you when I trust you, Ojichukwu said. Fair. The radio scanner crackled, a frequency she'd been monitoring, from the sound of it. She went to it immediately and turned it up just enough to hear the voice pattern without hearing the words. Her face did something brief and difficult. "They're calling in reinforcements," she said. "They know we're underground." "How?" "The channel access points have sensors. I installed them to monitor for flooding. Taeho's people must have found and mapped them." She was already moving, reassembling the supply pack, her hands working from memory. "The pump station won't hold for long." "Then we need a plan that doesn't depend on staying hidden," Jianyu said. She paused with her hands full of waterproof containers. "Say that again." "Hiding is a delay, not a solution. What's the actual endgame?" "The evidence reaches investigators who can't be bought or buried. Taeho is prosecuted. The buildings are condemned before they kill someone." She said it simply, like reading from a list she'd written a long time ago. "That's been the goal for 7 years. Then we need a way in, not a way out. We need a place where we control the geometry, and he walks into it believing he controls it." Jianyu was quiet a moment, putting pieces in alignment. "What does he believe he needs from you that he can't get any other way?" "The biological key. He believes that without it, the evidence files are inaccessible and can never be used against him." "Houndy Crown Tower." Her head came up. "I know it. Not well enough. He has a tower under construction on the Houndy Harbor front. I've watched it go up for 2 years. He's going to use that building's unveiling as a statement, his biggest project, his legacy piece." He kept his eyes on her. "It's also the most complex structure his firm has ever attempted. And you're a structural engineer who spent 7 months in an industrial facility 7 kilometers away from it." Ojichukwu set down what she was holding. "You think I know that building? I think you're the kind of person who would have studied it." A long beat. "From the corner," Kayamika said quietly. "She has all the blueprints." Ojichukwu closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. "I do," she said. Jianyu nodded. He said nothing else. The plan was not formed yet. It was just the first shape of itself, raw material that would need to be worked into something that could hold weight. But the architecture was there and they both felt it. Above them, he could hear the rain intensifying on the station's concrete roof, a sustained roar that was swallowing every other sound in the world, and somewhere in the drainage system, water was beginning to rise. The scanner crackled again. A new voice, cleaner signal, with it the specific cadence of someone giving orders rather than receiving them, a man used to people listening, for whom the concept of waiting was an insult to his importance. Ojichukwu's jaw set like a bar of steel being bent into position. "That's him," she said. "That's Taeho." Jianyu looked at the scanner, then at Ojichukwu, then, despite himself, at the girl in the corner, who was watching them both with absolute calm and the expression of a child who was doing the math on her own. "Then we're out of time," he said. "And we're done hiding." The water at the base of the station's access shaft was rising, and above them, the White Tiger of Busan was deciding, for the first time in 22 years, exactly what he was willing to fight for. The water was at Jianyu's ankles before Ojichukwu finished repacking. It came in fast, not a flood, not yet, but the kind of steady, measured rise that told you the drainage system above was at capacity and pushing back against itself. The concrete floor of the pump station had gone from damp to wet to covered in the space of 6 minutes, and the temperature of it was the kind of cold that climbed your legs and sat in your joints. Kayamika had pulled her knees up onto the folded tarp without being asked, watching the waterline with the careful attention of a child who has learned to take environmental threats seriously. "We need to move," Jianyu said. "I know that." Ojichukwu cinched the waterproof bag and slung it across her body, her movements quick and without waste. "The northeast shaft connects to a service access under the old dry dock. From there we can reach the surface behind the fuel depot. It's outside their current search radius." "How far is the fuel depot from the road?" 400 meters on open ground. "In this rain, in this dark, that's workable." He calculated. "I need a phone. Not the emergency unit, a clean line. There's a burner in the side pocket." He found it, a basic unit, prepaid and used, and he powered it on and typed a message to a number he'd had memorized for 11 years. a man named Yu Jae-ho who had worked for the Biko Syndicate as a logistics coordinator and now ran a private security consulting firm that Jeon-yu had helped capitalize with funds that didn't exist on paper. The message was 8 words. Need extraction, 2+1, standard protocol. Now, he sent it and put the burner in his jacket. Who did you contact? Ojichukwu asked. She was asking the wall, not him. But the question was direct. Someone who owes me and has the means to pay it. That describes most of the criminal infrastructure of South Korea. Yes, he said. It without apology. Move. The northeast shaft was narrow, a maintenance crawl space more than a true passage, its ceiling dropping to 1.5 meters at its lowest point, forcing them into a half-crouch that put immediate pressure on Jeon-yu's taped ribs and drew a controlled exhale through his teeth that he did not allow to become anything louder. The water in the shaft was 15 centimeters deep and moving, sluggish but persistent, carrying with it the particular smell of industrial drainage, oil, sediment, old chemical residue from decades of maritime operations. Kayamika moved through it with the tarp bag held above her head, her chin level, her breathing audible but not panicked. He watched the girl. He couldn't help it. She was a specific kind of problem for him, not a tactical problem, a different kind entirely, the kind his system had no clean protocol for. He'd been around children rarely and by design. They complicated things. They introduced variables that couldn't be managed. They made people stupid in ways that got people killed. He was aware that he was already being complicated by her. 20 minutes through the crawl space. The water peaked at knee height at the midpoint, cold enough to make the bones of his feet ache, and he heard Ojichukwu moving ahead of him with barely a splash. She knew exactly where to step, every stone, every drop in the floor. Behind him, the drainage system groaned with the weight of everything pouring into it from above. The service access beneath the dry dock was a vertical shaft with an iron ladder bolted to one wall. Ojichukwu went up first, checked the surface, came back down 2 rungs, and gave a single nod. They came out onto rain-slicked concrete behind a corrugated equipment shed. The fuel depot infrastructure dark and disused around them, the harbor lights barely visible through the downpour a kilometer to the south. Jeon-yu stood on the surface and breathed the rain air. His ribs were a specific burning presence on his left side now, an insistence he kept overriding. The burner phone buzzed. Jae-ho had responded. 15 minutes. Black van, south end of Yongsan Maintenance Road. Go. 15 minutes, he told Ojichukwu. She was scanning the darkness around them, her body turned into the wind, and he noticed the way she moved her head, methodical, sector by sector, not the random scanning of someone frightened, but the structured search pattern of someone who had been paying attention for long enough to do it correctly. She'd been running this for 7 months alone. No backup, no network. 1 engineer and 1 child against a man with the resources to send a cleaner team to an industrial warehouse at midnight in a rainstorm. South end of the maintenance road, she said. Can we make it in 15 on foot? Yes. They'll have someone watching the maintenance road. I know. Taeho's head of security is a man called Ma Sung-jin, former Special Forces. He doesn't make the kind of mistakes that let you walk past unseen. I know Sung-jin, he said quietly. Now she looked at him. How? We used the same contractor in 2016, before I understood who he was working for. A beat. Something moved across her face. Not quite disgust. Not quite the absence of it. You did business with Taeho's people. I didn't know they were his people at the time. A contractor is a contractor. He met her eyes. I stopped when I found out. That's everything I'll say about it tonight. It's not everything I want to hear about it. I know. He started moving south. Kayamika, stay between us. The open ground between the dry dock and the maintenance road was the worst 400 meters of the night. No cover, broken asphalt and gravel. The occasional dead piece of industrial equipment rising up in the dark like a monument to obsolescence. The rain was genuine concealment, visibility down to maybe 40 meters, everything beyond that a gray moving wall. But it was also noise-canceling, which meant he couldn't hear what he was walking toward. He moved with his left hand loosely fisted and his right hand free, keeping Kayamika's position in his peripheral vision at all times, and he felt the specific calibration of alertness that he'd lived in for 20 years settle back over him like a second skin. He'd been away from fieldwork for 3 years. He told himself that was intentional, strategic, a transition into executive function, the natural progression of a man who'd survived long enough to delegate the dangerous work to people who were paid to absorb it. His body was telling him otherwise. His body was telling him it remembered everything and had been waiting. They were 200 meters from the road when the light appeared. A single beam north of their position, sweeping slowly, someone on foot with a tactical light conducting a grid search. Jianyu put a hand on Kayamika's shoulder and she stopped immediately. No question, no hesitation. He and Ojichukwu went still simultaneously. The beam was moving away from them, but its arc would bring it back in approximately 40 seconds. "The press unit," Ojichukwu said, barely a breath. He didn't know what she meant. Then she moved low, quick, toward a rusted hydraulic unit 20 meters to their right that he hadn't registered as cover, and he understood. He took Kayamika's hand and they followed, reaching the shadow of the equipment as the beam began its return sweep. The light passed 3 meters from them. The figure carrying it was moving in the direction of the fuel depot. Professional pace, not rushing. Sung Jin ran patient searches. That was his reputation. He understood that people made mistakes when they were cold and tired, and he could afford to wait for those mistakes. Jianyu watched the light diminish and felt Kayamika's hand in his, small and cold, her grip steady. He looked down at her. She was watching the light with the same focused evaluation her mother used. Not frightened, waiting. He released her hand when the light was far enough. They kept moving. The van was there, black, nondescript, parked with its engine running in the shadow of a crane base at the south end of the maintenance road. The driver was a young man Jianyu didn't recognize. Jaeho's people, reliable by inheritance, and Jaeho himself was in the passenger seat, which told Jianyu more than the message had. Yu Jaeho was 51 years old and built like something that had been compressed under enormous pressure for a long time and had adjusted to that pressure. He had a broad, flat face and eyes that gave nothing away, and he climbed out of the van when they reached it and looked at Jianyu with the expression of a man who had expected to be called in eventually and was only surprised by the timing. "You look terrible," Jaeho said. "Ribs. How many?" "At least 2. He moved past the assessment. "I need a location secure with workspace, at least 2 days of operational capacity. Not in my network. Something clean. I have a facility in Yongdo, Marine Supply Company front. Hasn't been used operationally in 8 months. Jaeho glanced at Ojichukwu and Kayamika. He did not ask questions. That was one of the things Jianyu valued about him. 40 minutes in this traffic. Go. They loaded into the back. The van pulled onto the road without headlights until they were far enough from the search area, and the motion of it, the simple mechanical fact of being enclosed and moving, did something to the tension in the space that was not quite relief. The rain hammered the roof. The heater ran. Kayamika curled herself against her mother's side without ceremony and closed her eyes. Asleep within minutes with the particular efficiency of a child who has been managing on insufficient rest for too long and takes sleep where it presents itself. Ojichukwu did not sleep. She sat with her arm around her daughter and her eyes on the middle distance and said nothing. Jianyu sat facing backward, watching the road behind them. His ribs ached with every breath. He was running a mental inventory of resources. Jaeho's facility, the burner network he could access, his knowledge of Taeho's business infrastructure, his prior dealings with Sung Jin's contractor operation. Against that, a man with substantial resources and no constraint on violence, an active search team that now knew they'd gone underground, and a timeline that was undefined but compressing. After 20 minutes, Ojichukwu spoke. "How long have you known Taeho?" "Known of him, not known him. I've crossed paths with his business interests twice. He's not someone who operates in the spaces I've operated in. He works through institutional leverage, not muscle. Different ecosystem." He paused. "Until recently, apparently." "He changed," she said, not bitterly, as a structural observation. 2 years ago, he realized the evidence still existed. Before that, he thought Chitty had taken everything with him when he disappeared. When he found out the documentation was still intact and still accessible, She stopped. He got scared. He got desperate, which is worse. She was quiet a moment. A man who's protecting a business makes calculated decisions. A man who's protecting everything, his reputation, his freedom, his legacy, makes different ones. The cleaners tonight, he's used them twice before. A contractor in Gwangju who was about to testify. A regulatory official who refused a second payment. Her voice was factual, the way people who have processed terrible things into data speak about them. He's past the point where he's weighing options. He's in execution mode. Jianyu thought about the voice on the scanner, the specific cadence of it, the irritation of a man who is being required to supervise something he considered beneath his level. He came himself tonight. Yes, that's a mistake. He doesn't think it is. He's been told the evidence requires my physical presence to unlock. He believes capturing me tonight is the last step. Her jaw moved. He's been told a great number of things that aren't entirely true. By who? Silence. Ojichukwu. By a contact inside his organization who has been feeding him managed information for 18 months. She said it without looking at him. Someone I trust. He processed this. You have an inside source. Had. The contact went silent 9 days ago. Either they've been discovered, or they made a decision I didn't approve. Something crossed her face. An old wound, controlled but present. I don't know which. Does the contact know about Houndy Crown Tower? About what you're considering? She hesitated for just a fraction. They know I've studied the building. If they've been turned, I know what that means. Sharp, not defensive, preemptive, cutting off the conclusion before it could be spoken by someone else's mouth. I'm aware of every implication. He let it sit. Outside, the rain was beginning to ease, and the glow of Yongdo's coastal sprawl was beginning to appear on the horizon. What's your inside contact's name? He asked. No, not until I trust you. I told you that. You said fine. The circumstances have changed. My conditions haven't. He looked at her. The lantern light in the pump station had been one kind of illumination, hard, green-edged, making everything angular. The van's interior was something different, a kind of flatness that left faces looking tired and honest. Ojichukwu Nwosu was both of those things. She was also something he was finding increasingly difficult to categorize, and the difficulty was irritating in the specific way that anything was irritating when it mattered more than it was supposed to. He looked away. Fine. The Yongdo facility was a concrete building 200 meters from the waterfront, surrounded by a chain-link perimeter that looked casual and was not. Inside, a main floor that smelled of motor oil and salt air, a mezzanine with a partitioned workspace, a basic kitchen, and 2 sleeping areas that had been kept in minimal operational condition. Jaeho's people had stocked it within the last hour. Food, medical supplies, a change of clothing for 2 adults and a child in sizes that were approximately correct. Kayamika woke when the van stopped and was immediately alert, which told Jianyu she'd been asleep but not deeply. She looked around the facility with the comprehensive evaluation of someone assessing a new space for safety and utility, and then she found the workbench and its scattered components and went to examine them with the focused attention of a child who has found something worth understanding. Ojichukwu set the waterproof bag on the main table and began removing the notebooks. 7 of them, all sealed in individual plastic bags, all labeled in a handwriting system that was obviously coded. She spread them across the table in an order that was not random. Jianyu sat down across from her and watched. The buildings, she said. 11 structures across 3 cities. The documentation breaks into 3 categories. She pointed at the notebooks in sequence. Structural deficiency reports, my engineering assessments with photographic evidence. Financial records. Chitty compiled these payments, accounts, the money that moved to buy silence. Witness statements. 12 contractors and 4 regulatory officials who have given recorded testimony under conditions of anonymity. Where are the original files? Distributed. Multiple secure locations. Physical copies and encrypted digital backups. She looked at him. The distribution is mine. I'm the only person who knows the complete map of it. And Taeho thinks the map is in my body. In my scarring pattern, specifically. He believes it's a biometric encryption system that the scars form a visual key that, when photographed in sequence and processed, decrypts the file access codes. She said it without expression. It's completely plausible, which is why it worked. I'm an engineer. I understand biometric systems. I know exactly how to describe a fake one convincingly. You gave him that story 2 years ago, when I understood that running wasn't an option, and that I needed something that made me valuable alive. She pulled one of the notebooks toward her and opened it. It bought time. It stopped 3 attempts to simply eliminate us. But it also meant they'd keep coming until they had me. She paused over the notebook. Tonight was the first time they brought Taeho himself. The first time they brought enough force to be confident. Because the story is about to expire, Jeonyu said. She looked up. He's been patient for 2 years. Now he's here personally. That means he has a deadline. Something is changing in his world that makes the timeline critical. What's he building right now besides the tower? Ojichukwu was quiet for a long moment. There's a government infrastructure contract, 3 billion won, announced 6 weeks ago. It would be the largest project his firm has ever received. But the contract terms require a clean regulatory audit. No outstanding investigations. No unresolved compliance questions. The audit window opens in 40 days. 40 days. The compression of the timeline crystallized in Jeonyu's mind like a structure being resolved out of mist. So he needs everything clean in 40 days. He needs you and the evidence gone in 40 days. And he needs it done personally. Because he can't trust anyone else with the full scope of what he's erasing. Yes. Jae-ho appeared at the top of the mezzanine stairs. Boss. Problem. Jeonyu looked up. The search team at the Jangnam facility, they found the drain tunnel access. They're running the system with thermal imaging. The pump station. The direction they'd gone. If thermal imaging had picked up residual heat signatures in the shaft. How long ago? Jeonyu asked. 20 minutes. Which meant Sungjin had a general vector. Not this location, not yet, but a direction and a radius. How clean is this facility? Jeonyu asked. Clean enough for tonight. Not clean enough for 3 days, Jae-ho said. Taeho's people are thorough. Jeonyu looked at the notebooks spread across the table. He looked at Ojichukwu, who was already reassembling them into the waterproof bag with the economical speed of someone who had practiced exactly this, the rapid dismantling of a temporary base. He looked at the workbench, where Kayamika had found a disassembled radio component and was quietly sorting its parts by size. Then we're not staying 3 days, he said. Ojichukwu stopped with the bag half-packed. What are you saying? I'm saying the window for preparation is smaller than we thought. I'm saying Houndy Crown Tower doesn't wait for us to be ready. He pushed back from the table and stood. Sungjin is going to close the radius. Taeho is going to issue orders tonight that double the search. By tomorrow evening there isn't a warehouse or safe house in Busan that stays clean. He looked at her. You know I'm right. She knew. He could see it, the specific quality of someone who has reached the same conclusion from a different angle and is deciding whether to be angry that someone else got there simultaneously. We're not ready. We're not going to get more ready. Kayamika comes with us, or goes somewhere safer than this. Your call. The word landed between them with a deliberateness that was not accidental. Ojichukwu's eyes went to her daughter, and something passed through her expression that had nothing analytical in it. Something purely a mother's calculation, the one that has no clean answer. Kayamika looked up from the radio components. She'd been listening to the whole conversation. I want to stay with you, she said to her mother. Simple, definitive, no performance in it. Ojichukwu closed her eyes. 1 second. 2. Then she finished packing the bag. We need to talk about the building, she said. Everything I know about it. The weaknesses, the access points, the systems I embedded. She looked at Jeonyu. And you need to tell me exactly what you can bring to this. Not your reputation. Your actual resources. What you can put in that building that Taeho won't see coming. Agreed. And Jeonyu. She was using his name for the first time. He noticed. If we do this and it goes wrong, if Taeho gets what he believes he needs, there is no second chance. The evidence goes dark. The buildings stay up. and 4,000 people are living on a timer. I know. I need to know if you understand what that means. Not tactically. What it means. He held her gaze. He thought about the photograph Chitty had shown him, the small girl on the warehouse floor, the woman welding something enormous in the background. And then he thought about 11 buildings and 4,000 people and the specific weight of a debt that had been growing for 3 years. I understand it, he said. She held the look 3 more seconds. Then she nodded once. They were 4 hours into planning when Jae-ho's phone rang. He took it at the bottom of the stairs, voice low, back turned. Jeon-yu noticed the tension across Jae-ho's shoulders, the way the older man's head dropped slightly, the physical signature of someone receiving information that required processing before it could be presented. Jeon-yu set down the blueprint he'd been studying and waited. Jae-ho came back up the stairs. He did not sit down. What? Jeon-yu said. Jae-ho looked at Ojachukwu, not at Jeon-yu. That was the first wrong thing. Tell me, Ojachukwu said. Her voice had already changed. Some part of her had read the same signal. The contact, Jae-ho said. The one inside Taeho's organization. The room went very still. Kayamika was still asleep. The heater hummed. Outside, a fishing vessel somewhere in the harbor was running its engine in idle. His name is Song Min-ho, Jae-ho said. He surfaced 2 hours ago. He's with Taeho's security team at the Houndy Grand Hotel, executive floor. Ojachukwu did not move. Nothing in her moved. That's not possible. My source is solid. Min-ho arrived with Taeho's convoy at 11:47. He was introduced to the hotel security staff as Taeho's senior intelligence coordinator. Senior intelligence. She stopped. He's been with them for 8 months minimum. My source had to go back through records to find the entry point. Jae-ho kept his voice level with the particular effort of someone delivering a terminal diagnosis. He was never a double agent feeding you managed information. He was feeding Taeho managed information about you. Every intelligence product you received through him, the search patterns, the cleaner deployment schedules, the regulatory timeline, was curated. The silence that followed was the worst kind. Not the silence of people who have nothing to say, but the silence of a structure coming apart at its load-bearing points. Jeon-yu watched Ojachukwu Nwosu absorb this the way he'd watched her absorb everything tonight, through the body first, a physical response she contained before it could become visible, a tightening around the eyes and a stillness in the hands that was the opposite of relaxation. The regulatory timeline, she said. Her voice was flat in the way a surface is flat when it's been sanded down to nothing. Fabricated. We don't know the real deadline, Jae-ho said. The distribution locations. She was already moving, pulling the notebooks toward her. If Min-ho knew the distribution plan, he knew the outline, not the specifics. You never gave him the specifics. Jae-ho paused. But he knew enough to tell Taeho which parts of the city to watch. Jeon-yu was on his feet. The locations. Are they burned? One of them, the Namhang location, had a surveillance team on it as of 3 hours ago. Jae-ho's voice was careful. We picked it up because my source monitors that frequency. It's been covered for 6 days. 6 days. Ojachukwu had planned to activate that location first because it held the financial records, the corporate money trail, the most legally actionable portion of the entire evidentiary package. If that location was under surveillance, approaching it meant walking into a controlled position. If the financial records weren't distributed, the evidence package was incomplete. A case without the money trail was a structural engineer's report and a series of anonymous contractor statements, compelling to a journalist, insufficient for prosecution. The other 2 locations, Jeon-yu said, so far as we know, clean. But if Min-ho has been managing the intelligence feed for 8 months, we don't know what he knows about those locations or when he communicated it. Then we assume they're burned too. We don't know. We assume. Jeon-yu looked at Ojachukwu. The plan requires the documentation to be moving before you're inside that building. That's non-negotiable. Without it, you're just a woman Taeho thinks he needs. And the moment he extracts what he believes he needs, the moment he extracts it and realizes it doesn't work, Ojachukwu said. Her voice was completely controlled and completely dead. He kills me. Yes. She put both hands flat on the workbench. She stood like that for a long moment and Jianyu watched her, and he understood that what he was watching was someone who had built 7 years of work on a single foundational assumption, that Song Min-ho was loyal, and was now standing in the rubble of that assumption, trying to locate anything load-bearing that was still intact. The scars, she said. He waited. Taeho believes the biometric key is in my scarring. He believes I have to be present and alive to use it. She lifted her hands from the workbench, turned them over. The welding scars ran across her palms and up her forearms, elaborate topography, years of work written into her skin. He's going to want to document them, photograph them. He'll have a technical team ready to process the images against a decryption system he's been building for 2 years. A decryption system for a key that doesn't exist, Jianyu said. A decryption system that his technical team built based on the specifications I fed through Min-ho. She looked up. Specifications I designed to fail in a specific way. A way that would require my continued cooperation to resolve. Jae-ho made a sound that wasn't quite a word. She built a trap inside the trap. I built a contingency, Ojichukwu said. For exactly this scenario. Not this scenario specifically. I didn't know about Min-ho. But the scenario where Taeho thought he had everything he needed and tried to proceed without me. She pulled one of the notebooks, the one with the red band, and opened it. Inside, dense notation in the same precise handwriting, interspersed with what looked like design schematics for a software interface. The decryption system I built will run the photographic scans and produce output. The output will look like partial decryption, like the process is working, but 90% complete, and requires a final authentication that only I can provide verbally. How? Because I built the specification to require a voice authentication component. A spoken passphrase in a specific sequence. No phrase, no completion. And the phrase, she closed the notebook, is something only I know. The intelligence of it settled over the room like a weight. Jianyu stood with it a moment, turning it over, looking for the places where it failed. If Taeho believes the process is 90% complete, he doesn't kill you immediately, he said. He keeps you alive for the final authentication. Yes, and that window is the operational space. That was always the plan. The distribution locations were the fail-safe, evidence moving through legitimate channels so that even if the window closed early, the documentation survived. She set the notebook down. Without the distribution locations, the window is the only thing between those buildings and everything staying exactly as it is. How long does the window give us? His technical team will need to run the scan process. That takes time. They'll be thorough because they've been waiting for this for 2 years. Initial scan processing, output generation, the apparent partial completion. He'll see results within 2 hours of beginning the process. But the authentication requirement will hold him for, she paused, 6 hours. Maybe 8 if he's methodical, if he panics less. 6 to 8 hours to get the evidence out through an alternate channel and get Taeho on record admitting to enough that investigators can act without the documentation. The documentation isn't gone, she said sharply. It's just inaccessible through the primary distribution points. If we get out of that building alive with a clean recording of Taeho's admissions, the documentation becomes supporting material rather than primary evidence. The admissions carry the prosecution. The documentation buries him. Jianyu looked at her for a long moment. You planned for the documentation to be secondary all along. She held his gaze. I planned for every contingency I could think of. I'm an engineer. I don't build things with single points of failure. Except Song Min-ho. The words were out before he measured them. He saw them land, a clean impact, nothing soft about it, and watched her absorb it the same way she absorbed everything tonight, through the body and then into something harder and further down. Except Min-ho, she said. He shouldn't have said it. He knew that. He said it anyway because there was no version of moving forward that didn't account for the blind spot, and leaving it unspoken was the same as pretending it wasn't there. He'd learned that in Ulsan in 2009. He'd learned it at significant cost. From the corner, Kayamika's voice came quietly. Mama! They both looked. The girl was awake, sitting up, the radio component still in her lap, looking at her mother with the steady dark eyes that saw everything and sorted it with terrifying efficiency. "I heard what you said about Mr. Minho." Ojichukwa's expression did something that had nothing structural about it. Something purely and completely a mother's face in the presence of a child who has just understood that a person they trusted was not what they appeared. "I know, baby. Was he ever real? Did he ever actually?" "I don't know yet," Ojichukwu said. "I don't know how far back it goes." Kayamika nodded. She looked down at the radio components in her lap and began reassembling them in silence with steady hands. And the steadiness of those hands was the most heartbreaking thing in the room. Jianyu turned away. He stood at the mezzanine window and looked at the coastal road and the harbor beyond it, the water black and flat now that the rain had stopped, the distant lights of the commercial port throwing gold across the surface. His ribs ached. His feet were still cold from the drainage channel. He had 36 hours of stubble and the specific exhaustion of someone who had been running on adrenaline since the first vibration of the dead phone in his jacket pocket. He thought about the 43-story building on the harbor front, the weaknesses Ojichukwu had described, the glazing anchors, the barrier control relay, the specific load points she documented 2 years ago. He thought about Ma Sungjin's methodical search closing toward this facility. He thought about Song Minho sitting in the executive floor of the Houndy Grand, and Taeho somewhere in that hotel conducting a reorganization of his operation now that tonight's field deployment had failed to produce the expected outcome. He thought about what needed to be true for the next 24 hours to produce a result that was survivable. And then Jaeho's phone rang again. Jaeho answered it. 2 seconds of listening. Then he said, "How many?" And his voice was the voice of a man who had spent 30 years not being surprised by bad news and was failing at that project. He looked at Jianyu. The Yongdo facility. A vehicle just ran the perimeter on the coastal road. Slow pass, no headlights. It stopped for 40 seconds at the north end, then continued. He checked his watch. "We have maybe 2 hours before they run it again with more bodies." Jianyu looked at Ojichukwu. She was already standing, the waterproof bag repacked, the notebook sealed. She had Kayamika on her feet beside her, the girl's shoes on, the tarp folded and set aside, as if cleaning up after herself was a reflex that no amount of urgency could interrupt. "We need to move Kayamika tonight," Jianyu said. "I know." Ojichukwu's voice was steady. Her hands were not. He saw it. A fine tremor in her right hand as she adjusted the strap of the bag. A single involuntary betrayal of everything she was carrying. She controlled it within 2 seconds, but he saw it. "Jaeho will take her personally," Jianyu said. "Not a driver. Jaeho." Jaeho looked at him with an expression that communicated several things about professional pride, and then resolved into the expression of a man who understood what was actually being asked. "Yes," he said. Ojichukwu crouched down in front of Kayamika. She took her daughter's face in both hands, the scarred hands, the engineer's hands, and looked at her for a long moment without saying anything. Kayamika looked back at her with those eyes that didn't flinch from anything. "You're going to go with Mr. Jaeho," Ojichukwu said. "You're going to do exactly what he says. You're going to be somewhere safe. And then I'm going to come get you," Kayamika said. It was not a question. It was a condition. Ojichukwu's jaw set. "And then I'm going to come get you." Kayamika nodded once, the specific nod of someone who has registered a commitment and is filing it as binding. Then she looked past her mother at Jianyu, and the look she gave him was not a child's look. It was the look of someone assigning responsibility. "Uncle Jianyu," she said, "you come get her first. Then she comes for me." The thing that happened in Jianyu's chest was not something he had a name for. He had been, for 22 years, a man who did not make promises. He had been, for 22 years, a man who understood that promises were structural liabilities, weight you added to a system that was already under load. He looked at the 8-year-old girl with her father's eyes and her mother's steadiness and the absolutely unmovable expectation on her face. "Yes," he said. Kayamika nodded again. She picked up her small bag and went to stand next to Jaeho with the composure of someone much older. Ojichukwu stood and turned away before her face could finish what it had started, and Jianyu understood that the turning away was not weakness but the opposite. A woman who understood that showing Kayamika a mother falling apart was the one thing she would not do, regardless of what it cost her to hold the line. Jae-ho was already moving, the van keys in his hand, with the particular efficiency of a man who knew that the kindest thing he could do right now was remove the child from the room quickly and without ceremony. The side door opened and closed, and the engine turned over, and the sound of it faded south toward the coastal road. Then the facility was quiet. Ojichukwu stood with her back to the room for 11 seconds. Jeonyu counted without meaning to. Then she turned around. Her face was assembled. Her eyes were dry. "Tell me the access route," she said. They left the Yongdo facility 40 minutes later in a vehicle Jae-ho had left behind. A gray delivery van, nondescript, with commercial plates registered to a seafood distributor that had been dormant for 2 years. Jeonyu drove. Ojichukwu sat in the passenger seat with the red-banded notebook open on her knees, talking through the building's interior in the level tone of someone conducting a briefing. No excess, no sentiment. The plan had one moving part that couldn't be controlled. The capture had to look real. Everything else radiated outward from that requirement. The capture had to be something Sung Jin's team discovered and reported, not something Tae-ho was told about by an intermediary he might doubt. It had to happen in a location consistent with Ojichukwu's known movement patterns. It had to produce Ojichukwu in a condition consistent with a genuine apprehension. Stressed, physically present, not visibly cooperative. And it had to happen fast enough that Tae-ho, under the pressure of his own failing timeline, would move to the tower rather than establishing a secondary location for the evidence extraction. The secondary location option was the one that killed them. If Tae-ho chose to extract the evidence somewhere other than Houndy Crown Tower, the barrier system was irrelevant. They'd have no geometry, no prepared infrastructure, no leverage except Ojichukwu's body and whatever Jeonyu could improvise in an unknown space. "He won't choose a secondary location," Ojichukwu said. She was reading his face. "The tower is his statement piece. He's been building it for 4 years. If he extracts the evidence that dismantles his biggest threat inside his biggest building, she paused. "It's how he thinks. I've been studying how he thinks for 7 years. He needs the symbolism of it. Men who need symbolism are dangerous. Men who need symbolism are predictable." She looked back at the notebook. "There's a service entrance on the building's north face. Basement level, maintenance access, card reader controlled, but the system feeds back to the B2 Security Operations Center. I can spoof the card credentials. I have someone for that." "Who?" "A man named Jang Duyun. He builds access systems for commercial properties and occasionally modifies them for people who need doors open that aren't supposed to open. He kept his eyes on the road. He's done work for me twice. He doesn't know what the work was for and doesn't ask. You have a lot of people who don't ask questions. I cultivated them specifically." She was quiet a moment. Then, "Call him." The staged capture happened at 6:41 in the morning in an alley behind a convenience store in the Busan Gijang district, 3 kilometers from Houndy Crown Tower. It was Ojichukwu's choice of location. She'd used this district twice in the past 7 months for supply runs, paying in cash, keeping her face down. Sung Jin's team had traces of her in the area, security camera fragments, a transaction record from a pharmacy 6 blocks east. The story held. A woman hiding in the industrial district would eventually come into the city for supplies. A search team running a compressed radius in the pre-dawn hours would find exactly that. Jeonyu was half a block north in a doorway watching. The 2 men from Sung Jin's team came around the corner at 6:39. They'd been running the grid since 5. He'd tracked them on the burner scanner for the past hour, close enough to the facility's frequency that Jae-ho's earlier read had been correct. They were professional. They moved in the specific compressed pattern of people who had been doing this long enough that it had become physical habit rather than conscious choice. They found Ojichukwu because she allowed them to find her. She was standing at the convenience store's service entrance, a bag of supplies in her hand, when their light caught her. He watched her face in the beam, the flash of genuine-looking panic, the half-turn that looked like the beginning of flight and was actually a controlled decision to stay. Her body language in the next 30 seconds was a performance of such precision that even knowing it was performance, Watching it made something cold move through him. She did not make it easy for them. She made it hard enough to be credible. A struggle against the wall, a knee that connected with the shorter man's thigh, her bag thrown wide across the asphalt so its contents scattered, items consistent with a woman surviving on the run, nothing that revealed operational planning. She went down on one knee on the wet asphalt and let herself be pulled up and zip-tied with the specific quality of someone whose body is continuing to resist even as the outcome is decided. The taller man got on his radio. Jianyu heard Sung Jin's voice crackle back across 40 meters of Pre-Dawn Street. "Confirm it's her. Don't move her until I'm there." Jianyu pulled back into the doorway. His ribs were hot coals on his left side. He'd retaped them at the facility, but the night's accumulated damage was past the point where tape was anything other than psychological. He breathed through it the way he breathed through everything. Not deeply, just steadily, just enough. He had 1 hour before Taeho would be mobilizing his tower team. The service entrance credentials from Jang Duyun had arrived at 4 in the morning, delivered as a data package to the burner phone. 2 access cards that would read as legitimate maintenance personnel on the B2 system for a window of 6 hours. After 6 hours, the intrusion would be detected by the system's integrity check. 6 hours was what they had. He moved. Houndy Crown Tower at 7 in the morning was a construction site on its upper floors and a functioning commercial building on its lower ones. The ground floor retail spaces were in fit-out stage. The parking structure was operational. The Security Operations Center on B2 was staffed by a 2-person overnight team that would rotate out at 8. Jianyu came through the north service entrance at 7:12 with the card Duyun had built and a maintenance uniform he'd sourced from a supply depot near the Yongdo facility. The uniform fit badly across the shoulders. He walked as if it fit perfectly. The camera at the service entrance read the card, processed it, and opened the door with a click that was the most relieving sound he'd heard in 12 hours. The server room, B3, needed 5 minutes, and then the mezzanine on 38. The server room was cold and loud, the particular white noise of computational infrastructure, fans running constantly, the air carrying that specific electric smell that meant heat being managed under pressure. He found the communications trunk he was looking for in 40 seconds, because Ojichukwu had drawn it on the blueprint from memory with the accuracy of someone who had stood in this room 18 months ago and filed every detail. He attached the transmitter, a device about the size of a thumb purchased 3 months ago by a syndicate logistics coordinator and never used, still in its original packaging, to the secondary communications port, verified the signal on the burner phone, and was out of the server room in 4 minutes and 20 seconds. By the time he reached the 38th floor via the maintenance stairwell, his shirt was wet through and his left side was a sustained roar he was no longer managing so much as coexisting with. He stood in the stairwell and breathed and looked at the door to 38. Beyond it, the barrier control relay Ojichukwu had modified 2 years ago, the 3 sections that would seal the penthouse level on the trigger sequence. He needed to manually verify the modification was still intact. 2 years was a long time in a building under construction. Workers passed through. Systems got checked. If someone had inadvertently repaired what Ojichukwu had deliberately altered, the trap had no teeth. He went through the door. The 38th floor was raw, concrete pillars, cable runs, the skeleton of what would eventually be residential units visible in the unfinished partition framing. The barrier control relay was in a mechanical closet at the corridor's midpoint, behind a panel that required a specific tool to open. He had the tool. Ojichukwu had told him what to bring with the same meticulous specificity she brought to everything, and he'd sourced it from the maintenance depot at the same time as the uniform. He opened the panel. The modification was still there, exactly as she'd described it. A secondary relay board wired in parallel with the original, so subtle in its installation that a routine maintenance check would read it as standard redundancy rather than an addition. She had done this in 15 minutes during a site visit 18 months ago, working alone in a room exactly like this one, with the specific calm of someone who was building something they might never use but needed to exist regardless. He closed the panel. He looked at his watch. 7:41. He had a message from a number he didn't recognize. A number Ojichukwu had given him before they'd separated. A one-use contact she'd set up weeks ago for exactly this kind of contingency. He's moving. Convoy from the hotel. ETA Tower 40 minutes. I'm in the vehicle. 40 minutes. He typed back. Relay intact. Transmitter active. I'm on 38. Her response came in 8 seconds. Voice recorder running. Don't come up until barrier activates. If you come up before the barrier, he kills you and it ends. He looked at the message for a moment. Then he typed, I know. Her response to that was nothing, which was correct. There was nothing to say. He spent the next 31 minutes on the 38th floor in the raw concrete silence, and it was the hardest 31 minutes he could remember spending in a very long time. Not because of the physical damage, though the ribs were talking to him in a language that was getting harder to ignore, but because of the specific quality of waiting when someone else was in the dangerous position and the waiting was the requirement, and there was nothing he could do to make the dangerous position less dangerous from where he stood. He had felt this once before, in 2009, waiting outside a building in Ulsan while 2 of his men were inside. He'd been the one who sent them in. He'd been the one who decided the intelligence was solid. The intelligence had not been solid. He'd heard the outcome from 30 meters away and said nothing at the funeral and locked the door on that room and lost the key. He was aware that the door was not fully locked tonight. At 8:19, the building's alarm system produced a single low tone, not a full alarm, a system status notification, the kind that meant a significant access event had been logged. He felt it through the concrete floor before he heard it. He was already moving to the stairwell. The barrier activation would produce the same tone, amplified. He needed to be at the stairwell door to 42 when it came. He took the stairs 2 at a time, his left arm pressed against his side, his breathing audible in the stairwell's vertical concrete shaft, each impact of foot against step sending a jolt through the left side of his chest that was precise and merciless. For floors. He was at the 39th landing when his phone vibrated. He stopped, looked at the screen. He's talking. Everything he said about Gwangju, about the official, he's saying it all. His chest did something that was not about the ribs. Keep him talking, he typed. I know how to keep him talking. He kept moving. 40th floor landing. He could hear voices now, muffled through the fire door, filtered through concrete and steel, but present. Taeho's voice had the specific carrying quality of a man who had spent years in rooms where he was the only person speaking and had let his voice calibrate to that assumption. 41st floor. The voices were clear. He stopped at the fire door and pressed his back against the wall beside it and listened. Taeho was speaking in the measured cadence of someone delivering a verdict. Not angry, not triumphant. Something colder than both. The voice of a man who had waited 2 years for this specific moment and was allowing himself to inhabit it fully. Jeonyu caught fragments through the door. Everything Chitty built. And your scars don't mean anything to me personally. And the one that made something in his jaw harden. The girl can come home now. There's no point anymore. He heard Ojichukwa's voice, low, controlled, doing exactly what she'd said she could do. Managing the pace, feeding responses that kept the monologue running, guiding the conversation toward admission after admission with the patience of an engineer who understood load distribution. Then he heard the technical team's voice, a younger man, deferential, the tone of someone reporting to a superior. Sir, the scan is running. We have initial output in approximately 90 minutes. 90 minutes until the false decryption sequence produced its partial result. 90 minutes until Taeho's patience with the conversation would peak and begin to collapse inward. Jeonyu checked the time. 8:26. He waited. At 8:31, Taeho said something that brought the room to a different quality of silence. Jeonyu felt it through the door, a shift in the acoustic texture that meant the dynamic in the room had just changed. You know what I've always respected about you, Taeho said, and the warmth in his voice was the most dangerous thing Jeonyu had heard all night. It's that you never stopped believing the documentation would be enough. That evidence, properly presented, would be sufficient. You still believe institutions work. A pause. They don't. I am the institution. I built the institution. The men who would prosecute me are men I've put in their positions. And the men who would replace them are men I'm currently financing. Your evidence, your beautiful, meticulous 7-year evidence, is going to end up in a room full of people who work for me. And you're going to watch that happen from a place where watching is the only thing you can still do. Jeonyu's hand was on the fire door. He did not open it. He held the handle and breathed and held the door closed and did not move because Ojichukwu had said, Don't come up before the barrier activates, and she had been right, and she was still right, and the requirement had not changed. He heard her voice from inside the penthouse, still level, still controlled, still doing the work. Then I want to hear you say what you did. Not because I'm going to use it. A pause that was perfectly calibrated. Because I want to know if you're capable of saying it out loud. Men like you usually aren't. The silence that followed lasted 4 seconds. Then Taeho laughed. It was a genuine laugh, not performed, not strategic. The actual laugh of a man who has just been offered exactly what his ego needs in a moment of complete certainty. And he began to talk. He talked about the Gwangju contractor. He talked about the regulatory official. He talked about the structural reports and the money that had relocated 12 human beings from the trajectory of truth to the trajectory of compliance. He talked about Chidi Nwosu with the specific contempt of a man describing a problem he'd solved efficiently. He talked about the buildings, 11 of them, the numbers he'd saved on materials, the approvals he'd purchased, the calculations he'd done on acceptable risk. And the way he described it was the way a man describes craftsmanship, because to him it was, every word was feeding into the transmitter on B3. Every word was already traveling through a clean channel to a data recorder that Jae-ho had positioned outside the building's communication radius before dawn. At 8:47, the building's system produced a tone that was not a status notification. The barrier alarm was a sustained 2-second pulse that moved through the structure the way a tuning fork moves through water. Jian-yu felt it in his sternum. He heard the penthouse go from controlled monologue to sudden contained chaos. Voices cutting across each other. Something moving fast across the floor. Taeho's voice dropping from performance into command. What is that? What is that sound? The fire door came open under Jian-yu's hand. The stairwell to 42 was 6 meters ahead. He covered it in 4 seconds. The stairwell door at 42 was sealed. The barrier system had locked it from the inside as designed, which meant it was also locked from the outside. The variable Ojichukwu had told him about it too in the morning with the flat precision of someone describing a problem they'd already solved. The external manual override is a panel beside the door. The code is 6 digits. The digits are the load specifications for the east elevation glazing anchor. The correct specifications, not the installed ones. The ones Taeho buried. He found the panel. He entered the 6 digits with his right hand, his left pressed to his side, his breathing loud in the stairwell. The door released. He went through. The penthouse of Houndy Crown Tower was 42 stories of glass and harbor light, and at 8:49 in the morning, with the sun coming in low and hard off Busan Harbor, and the steel barrier panels dropped across every elevator shaft and secondary exit, it looked exactly like what it was. A room designed as a monument to one man's certainty that he had won. Now sealed from the inside, the exits closed, the man himself standing in the center of it with the expression of someone who has just understood that every calculation he made was built on a foundation that was never there. Young Taeho was 60 years old and looked 50. He had the posture of a man who had never had reason to make himself small, and even now, even with the barriers down and his security team moving to positions and Jian-yu coming through the door that was not supposed to open, he held that posture. Beside him, 2 technical staff at a portable workstation. Behind him, a window that was 42 stories of open air and harbor. Sung Jin was already moving. He came from the east side of the room, fast, with the specific compressed violence of someone who had been preparing for this since the moment the barriers dropped, and Jian-yu had approximately 1 second to read his trajectory before they met. It was not a clean fight. Nothing about it was clean. Sung Jin was former Special Forces, and he was not carrying 2 cracked ribs and the accumulated damage of a night in drainage tunnels, and the first exchange drove Jian-yu back 3 meters against the window wall with an impact that exploded white across his vision and turned his left side into something beyond pain. A systemic shock, the body going past the register of pain into a different kind of signal entirely. He stayed up. He stayed up by the specific decision to stay up, nothing physical about it, just a choice made in the whiteout space where thought should have been. He heard Ojichukwu's voice from across the room, sharp and immediate. Jian-yu. He didn't answer. He needed the breath for other things. Sung Jin came back in. He was controlled and he was patient, and he was going to win this in 3 more exchanges if Jian-yu fought him the way he'd been fighting all night. Absorbing, managing, surviving. So Jian-yu stopped surviving and started spending. He stopped taking the defensive line and walked straight into Sung Jin's next attack, and it was brutal and direct and cost him in ways he was going to have to assess later. But it also ended it because Ma Sung-jin had been trained to fight someone who was trying to survive, and Jeon-yu had just stopped doing that, and the difference between those two things was enough. Sung-jin went down. Jeon-yu stood over him and breathed, just breathed in and out. The harbor light was everywhere. His left hand was shaking in a way he'd never experienced before. He pressed it against his thigh and held it there until it stopped. Taeho's remaining security, 2 men, tactical, positioned at the north corners, looked at their employer. Taeho looked at them. Something passed between them that had nothing to do with loyalty and everything to do with the arithmetic of the situation. Taeho raised one hand, a small gesture, precise. Both men stood down. The penthouse went silent except for the building's alarm tone running its steady pulse through the structure and the harbor outside and Jeon-yu's breathing. Ojichukwu walked across the room to stand beside him. She was still zip-tied at the wrists, or they'd removed the restraints at some point, or she'd removed them herself. He wasn't tracking that detail. She was moving with the controlled deliberateness of someone in the final stage of something they've been working toward for 7 years. She stopped 2 meters from Jung Taeho. She looked at him the way a structural engineer looks at a building she's condemned. "It's already gone," she said. Her voice was level. "The recording. Everything you said. It's outside this building right now." Taeho looked at her. His face was very still. "You're lying. You spent 2 years believing I built a biometric encryption system," she said. "You spent 2 years paying a man to feed me false intelligence and believing he was working for you." She let that settle. "I need you to ask yourself how much of what you think you know tonight is something I wanted you to think." The stillness on Taeho's face cracked. Not dramatically, not the collapse of a villain confronting defeat. Something smaller and therefore worse, the specific fracture of a man who has just understood that his model of reality has been wrong for long enough that he cannot locate the moment it diverged from truth. He looked at the barrier panels, at Sung-jin on the floor, at the 2 men who had stood down, at the technical staff who were very carefully looking at nothing, at Ojichukwu. "The buildings," he said. His voice was quiet. "You can't. The audit, the contract, the contract is the least of what's coming," she said. Taeho looked at Jeon-yu for the first time since he'd come through the door, and the look was long and assessing and had at its core the specific quality of a man trying to locate a transaction, trying to find the version of this where there was still something to negotiate, something to offer, some denominator that 2 men of a certain kind could agree on, while the woman between them became a variable rather than a fixed point. Jeon-yu looked back at him and said nothing, because there was nothing, because the transaction Taeho was looking for didn't exist in this room, and the specific quality of Jeon-yu's silence was the answer to that search. Not hostile, not triumphant, just the flat refusal of a man who had spent 22 years understanding exactly what he was willing to sell, and had, sometime in the last 14 hours, quietly removed this particular thing from the inventory. Taeho read it. He was not a stupid man. He had built an empire on his ability to read the arithmetic of a room, and the arithmetic of this room was now fully legible. He stood with it for a long moment, with the posture he'd always had, straight-spined, composed, a man who had decided a long time ago that the appearance of control was worth maintaining even when control itself was gone. Then he sat down in one of the penthouse chairs slowly, put his hands on his knees, and looked at the harbor through 42 stories of glass. "How long?" he said, not to either of them specifically, to the room. "The recording has been outside the building since 8:31, Ojichukwu said. Jae-ho delivered it to a federal investigator at 8:54. She checked the time. "That was 11 minutes ago." A long silence. "The buildings," Taeho said again. His voice had changed. Not broken, deflated, the specific sound of air leaving a structure that had been pressurized for a very long time. "How many did you document?" "All 11, Ojichukwu said. "Every deficiency. Every structural report you buried. Every person you paid to look away." She paused. 4,000 people are going to leave those buildings before they're condemned. That process starts today. Taeho looked at his hands on his knees. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said very quietly, "I didn't think anyone would stay. I didn't think any engineer would stay in this country after I buried the first report. I know you didn't. You should have left. I know that too. Something moved across his face that was not quite remorse, closer to the recognition of a calculation that had been wrong from the beginning. A structural error he hadn't caught because he'd never believed the structure would be tested this way. Then it was gone, the face closed back over it. He looked at the harbor and said nothing more. The two security men were still standing at the north wall. One of them had his phone out now, not operating it, just holding it, the instinct of a man who knew the situation had concluded and was waiting for someone to tell him what the conclusion meant for him specifically. Jianyu looked at them. "Sit down," he said. "Both of you on the floor." They sat. No argument. The arithmetic was clear to them too. He looked at the technical staff, young men, both of them, with the specific expression of people who had believed they were working a corporate security detail and had arrived this morning to something considerably different. Away from the workstation. North wall. They moved. Jianyu crossed to the portable workstation and looked at the screen. The false decryption sequence was running. Ojichukwu's phantom system, the 2-year trap she'd built and baited and finally sprung. The progress bar read 63%. The screen showed a cascade of what looked like genuine cryptographic processing, dense and technical and completely fabricated, and it was beautiful in the specific way that a perfectly engineered deception is beautiful, not in spite of its falseness but because of how completely it understood the thing it was pretending to be. He closed the laptop. He pulled his phone and called Jae-ho. Jae-ho answered on the second ring. "Done," he said before Jianyu could speak. "Investigator has the file. He's been briefed on the building locations. Condemnation process for the first 2 structures is being initiated." A pause. "He asked me to tell you the federal warrant for Taeho is being drafted." "How long?" "Given what's on that recording, his estimate is 90 minutes. Jianyu looked at Taeho in the chair, looking at the harbor. "Tell Kayamika's people she can come home." A longer pause. "She's already asking," Jae-ho said. And in his voice was the particular quality of a man who had spent the previous 3 hours with an 8-year-old who asked very direct questions and did not accept unsatisfying answers. "Tell her we're coming," Jianyu said. He ended the call. The warrant arrived in 78 minutes. 2 federal investigators came through the penthouse's manually overridden stairwell door at 10:14 in the morning, and they came with the specific demeanor of people who had spent the last hour reviewing a recording and had arrived prepared for the full weight of what it contained. The senior of the 2 was a woman named Investigator Shin, compact and precise, who looked at the room with the thorough evaluation of someone assembling an evidentiary record from the physical evidence of the space. She looked at Ma Sungjin, still on the floor and now conscious, sitting against the west wall with a split lip and the expression of a man doing complex professional calculations about his own future. She looked at the 2 security men and the technical staff. She looked at Jianyu, and the look was long and calibrated and contained a conversation that would happen later, not now. She looked at Jung Tae-ho in the chair by the window. "Mr. Jung," she said, "please stand." He stood. He straightened his jacket. He turned from the harbor to face her with the composed dignity of a man who had decided that the only thing he could still control was the manner of his exit, and he was going to control it to the end. Investigator Shin read him his rights in the flat procedural tone of someone who had done this many times, and the words fell into the room and settled, and Taeho listened to each one with his eyes level and his hands at his sides. When she finished, he looked once at Ojichukwu. A long look, the full weight of it, and in it was everything he hadn't said, sitting in that chair. The acknowledgement of 7 years of being outmaneuvered by someone he'd underestimated, and beneath that, buried deep where a man like him would never let it surface completely, the particular bitterness of someone who had told himself for 2 years that the woman with the scars was afraid, and had now understood that the scars were never the point. Ojichukwu held the look without flinching and without triumph. She held it the way a structure holds load, not by being hard, but by being deep, grounded past the point where surface force can reach. Taeho looked away first. They took him out through the stairwell and the building and into a waiting vehicle, and Jianyu watched from the penthouse window as the convoy pulled away below, and then he turned back to the room. Ojichukwu was sitting on the floor against the east wall, not collapsed, seated deliberately, the way someone sits when they've decided the body's argument can be acknowledged now that the mind no longer needs to override it. She had her knees drawn up and her arms resting across them and her head tipped back against the glass and her eyes closed. And the harbor light came in across her face and the scars on her hands and the cut on her forearm that had bled through the makeshift dressing they'd applied in the Yongdo facility. He sat down against the wall a meter away from her. His ribs were, at this point, an entity that deserved its own separate acknowledgement. He breathed carefully and looked at the ceiling, raw concrete, the pendant light fixtures still in their installation hardware, the penthouse unfinished above him in ways that made it feel oddly honest. They sat there for a while. Neither of them spoke. The building's alarm tone had stopped at some point during the investigator's arrival. The room was very quiet now. "The financial records," he said eventually. "The Namhang location. It was under surveillance." "I know. How did the evidence reach the investigator complete?" She was quiet for a moment. Then, "The Namhang location was a decoy. The third distribution point, the one I told Jae-ho about directly, the one Min-ho never knew existed, held the financial records. I've had a fourth distribution point since March. I didn't tell Min-ho it existed. I didn't tell anyone. Not even you." She opened her eyes and looked at the ceiling. "I needed Tae-ho to believe the financial records were inaccessible. If he'd known they were already in legitimate hands, he would have accelerated the timeline in ways I couldn't control." Jian-yu looked at the ceiling alongside her. "You built the fourth location when Min-ho went silent 9 days ago." Her voice was even. "When the contact goes silent, you assume the worst. That's basic operational security." A pause. "I've been doing this alone for 7 months. I couldn't afford to assume anything else. You should have told me." "Yes. No qualification, just agreement. I should have. By the time I trusted you enough to tell you, we were already in the building." He considered this. It was fair. He wouldn't have told him either. He would have held the critical failsafe until the moment it was needed, or until trust was established beyond calculation. And trust of that kind didn't establish itself in 14 hours over drainage tunnels and taped ribs. It built over time which they hadn't had. "Song Min-ho," he said. "The investigator will find him. The recording contains enough to establish a conspiracy that extends to Tae-ho's intelligence operation. Min-ho is part of that." 8 months, she said. "He was with them for 8 months before I understood something was wrong." Another pause, longer. "We were friends before all of this. Not close friends, but the kind you trust with specific things because they've been reliable for years." He said nothing. There was nothing useful to say. The specific grief of betrayal by someone you've trusted for years wasn't something that responded to words. He knew that. He'd had his version of it in different forms in different years, and every time it had required the same thing. Time and the decision to keep operating despite the recalibration of what trust meant. "He chose," she said finally. "I can't know exactly when or why he chose it. Maybe Tae-ho offered him something he needed. Maybe he decided the evidence was never going to be enough and he wanted to be on the winning side." Her voice had the quality of someone turning a stone over and looking at what's under it without flinching. "People choose. That's the whole thing. Everyone in this story chose. Including you. Including me." She looked down from the ceiling at her hands in her lap. The scarred hands, the engineer's hands, the hands that had welded traps into buildings and folded the evidence into waterproof bags and held her daughter's face in the pre-dawn dark before sending her away. 7 years ago, I chose to stay in this country and fight this. I could have left. Chitty wanted me to leave. He thought I was being a small, involuntary sound that was not quite a laugh. He thought I was being impossible. He wasn't wrong. "No," she said. "He wasn't wrong." They came out of the building at 11 in the morning into October sunlight, the kind Busan produced sometimes after a storm, flat and clean and making everything look like it had just been built. The harbor was silver. The cranes along the port were moving against a sky that had gone from the previous night's black to a very clean blue. Investigator Shin was waiting on the street outside. She looked at Jian-yu with the long look she'd been holding since she'd arrived at the penthouse. "Nam Jian-yu," she said. "You're going to come in and answer some questions." "Yes," he said. "I know." She looked at Ojichukwu. "You too, Ms. Nwosu. There's a medical team first." That arm needs attention. She paused. Your daughter is being brought in from Geoch. She'll be here by this afternoon. Shin's voice was precisely as warm as a federal investigator's voice needed to be, which was not very warm, but was genuine. She's fine. Jae-ho's people kept her occupied with something she apparently found more interesting than the situation warranted. She found a radio component, Jeonyu said. Shin looked at him. How did you know that? She started sorting one last night. She doesn't leave things unfinished. Something crossed Shin's face. Not quite a smile, the precursor to one. She turned back to the logistics of the day. The questioning took 4 hours. Jeonyu sat across from 2 investigators in a federal building that smelled of floor cleaner and old air, and gave honest answers to every question that didn't require him to identify people who didn't deserve identifying. And for those, he simply said, I can't answer that, without explanation and without apology, and the investigators wrote it down and moved to the next question. By the end of the 4 hours they had what they needed, and he had a legal status that was, if not clean, at least not immediately actionable, the complexity of his relationship to the events being sufficient to defer any prosecutorial decision to a timeline measured in months rather than hours. He had been through worse. Ojachukwa's questioning ran 6 hours, because she had 7 years of documentation to walk them through and a structural knowledge of Taeho's building empire that the investigators were going to need translated from engineering into language that held up in a courtroom. She did it with the same methodical precision she brought to everything. And when it was finished, she sat in a federal building hallway with a cup of coffee she'd been given and her arm properly dressed and her eyes carrying the particular quality of someone who has said the true thing out loud for the first time in 7 years and is still locating their own center in the absence of the weight. Jeonyu found her there. He sat down in the plastic chair beside her without ceremony, and she handed him half the coffee without looking, and he took it. They sat in the hallway and drank the shared coffee in silence. And outside the building's narrow windows the Busan afternoon moved past in its ordinary way. Traffic and pedestrians and the specific urban sound of a city that didn't know what had happened today in a half-finished penthouse 42 stories above its harbor, and wouldn't know for another 48 hours when the condemnation notices went up on 11 residential buildings across 3 cities. 4,000 people, he said. 4,217, she said. Final count. They'll be angry. They'll be alive. She looked at the window. They'll be angry and alive, and eventually they'll live in buildings that are what they're supposed to be. That's the transaction. She wrapped both hands around the coffee cup, the scarred hands, the engineer's hands. I can live with that transaction. A door opened at the end of the hallway, and Jae-ho came through first, and behind him, Kayamika. The girl had been given a change of clothes at some point. A sweatshirt 2 sizes large, clean jeans, her hair redone in the same 2 uneven braids she'd had when he'd first seen her in the shadow under the warehouse stairs. She had a small bag over one shoulder and a reassembled radio unit in her other hand, fully reconstructed, held with the careful pride of someone who has finished a project correctly. She saw her mother and stopped walking. Ojachukwu stood up. The plastic chair scraped back. She crossed the hallway in 3 steps, and Kayamika covered the remaining distance in a motion that was not quite running and not quite anything else, and the impact of the reunion was quiet, total, not the dramatic collapse of emotion but the simpler, more truthful version. A mother and daughter standing in a fluorescent-lit federal building hallway, holding each other with the full force of 14 hours that had required them to be apart. Jeonyu looked out the window. He was aware of Jae-ho standing beside him, also looking out the window, both of them doing the particular thing men of a certain kind do when they're in the presence of something genuine and don't know the correct etiquette for receiving it. After a long moment, Jae-ho said quietly, The syndicate's been calling. I know. Song Min-ho, sorry. Min-ho filed a formal objection to the meeting adjournment. The Japanese representative is threatening to renegotiate terms. Jeonyu looked at him. The deal is 30 million, Jae-ho said. I know what the deal is. Jeonyu watched the harbor through the narrow window. A container ship was moving slowly out of the port, loaded down to its Plimsoll line. Tell them the terms stand, and if there's another formal objection, I'll hear it personally. Tell the Japanese representative I'll call him tomorrow. He paused. And tell them both I was unavoidably detained. Unavoidably detained, Jae-ho repeated. with the tone of a man translating a sentence into a different language while keeping the words. Should I specify what detained you? No. Jae-ho nodded. He was quiet a moment. You look terrible. You mentioned that. Last time I meant aesthetically. This time I mean medically. I'll go to a doctor. When? Tomorrow. Today, Jae-ho said. Jian-yu looked at him. Jae-ho looked back with the expression of a man who had been following this particular person through various categories of disaster for 12 years and had developed a specific immunity to the expressions that were supposed to end conversations. Today, 3 weeks after the condemnation notices went up on Taeho's 11 buildings, the last of the 4,217 residents had been relocated to temporary housing. The process was not smooth. People were angry in the way people are angry when their safety has been gambled with by someone who understood the stakes and chose the gamble anyway. Not the hot anger of immediate shock, but the sustained, bone-deep anger of betrayal, the kind that doesn't resolve quickly and shouldn't. The first criminal charges were filed against Jung Tae-ho on the 6th day after his arrest. By the 3rd week, the charges had expanded to include 17 co-conspirators. For current municipal officials, and Song Min-ho, who was apprehended in Jeju attempting to board a flight with documentation that had been better 3 months ago than it was now. Oh Ji-chuk testified before an investigative committee on the 14th day. She sat before 11 officials in a formal chamber and explained structural engineering in terms accessible to people who had never thought about it before and probably didn't want to. And she was precise and she was patient and she was exactly as devastating as 7 years of preparation produced. The photographs of the deficient structures were in the official record. The financial documentation was in the official record. The recording from the penthouse was in the official record. Jung Tae-ho's attorneys were already beginning the negotiations that his kind of man's attorneys always began, looking for the reduced charge arrangement, the cooperation agreement, the transaction that converted a collapsed empire into something smaller and survivable. Investigator Shin had told Jian-yu privately, on the day of his follow-up questioning, that she did not expect Tae-ho to find the transaction he was looking for. The recording was too complete. The financial trail was too clean. Oh Ji-chuk's documentation was too thorough for any defense to dismantle without making the attempt itself look like an argument for guilt. She built something airtight, Shin said, with the flat respect of one professional acknowledging another. She builds things that hold weight, Jian-yu said. Shin looked at him a moment. What happens to the Biko syndicate, Mr. Nam? It evolves, he said. Into what? Something that doesn't require the word tiger. He said it without irony. I haven't decided on the name yet. Chidi Nwosu came back on a Tuesday in November. Not dramatically, not with a formal announcement or a coordinated arrival. He came on a commercial flight from a city he wasn't supposed to have been in, under a name he wasn't supposed to still be using, and he came through the arrivals hall at Gimhae Airport with a single bag and the specific careful walk of a man who had been looking over his shoulder for 4 years and was now trying to remember how people walk when they're not doing that. Oh Ji-chuk was there. Jian-yu was not. He had understood without being told that this was not a moment that required him, and he had the self-knowledge to recognize that understanding for what it was, not generosity but accuracy, the specific emotional intelligence of a man who had spent 22 years reading rooms and could read this one from a distance. He was in his office on the 14th floor of the Maritime Tower when she called him. He was looking at paperwork related to the syndicate's restructuring, legal documents, corporate filings, the slow formal machinery of becoming something different. When the phone rang, he looked at the screen and answered on the second ring. He's here, she said. I know. A pause. How did you know? Jae-ho monitors arrivals. Old habit. You didn't tell me. It wasn't mine to tell. He set down the paperwork. How is he? Thin. He looks like someone who's been carrying something heavy in a very small space for a very long time. Her voice was doing several things. He listened to all of them. Kayamika won't let go of his hand. Good. A longer pause, the kind that meant words were being considered and reconsidered. It's complicated, she said finally. I know. For years changes people. Yes. I don't. She stopped, started again. I don't know what this looks like going forward. I don't know what Chidi and I look like now. You don't have to know today. No. A breath. No, I suppose not. Then he wants to meet you, she said. Chidi. He said he wants to thank you. Jian-yu was quiet a moment. He doesn't need to thank me. He knows that. He wants to anyway, so do I, for that matter. I don't think You don't need to, Ojichuku. It's done. He looked at the harbor through the window, the same harbor, the same flat silver of it in the November light, the same slow movement of ships. Go be with your family. A pause that was not empty, full of the kind of weight two people accumulate in 14 hours of near-death and mutual damage and the specific intimacy of surviving something together. A weight that had no clean name and required no immediate resolution. Okay, she said. And then tomorrow. Tomorrow, he said. 6 months later, a community innovation center opened in the Busan Jangnam district, in a building that had been decommissioned industrial space 2 years earlier and had been rebuilt with structural specifications that Ojichukwu Nwosu had reviewed personally. Every load-bearing point signed off in her handwriting, every material certification verified against her standards. The center's name was carved into the stone at the entrance, the Chidi Nwosu Community Innovation Center, which Chidi had argued against for 3 weeks and eventually accepted when Kayamika told him flatly that arguing against it was embarrassing for everyone involved. The opening ceremony was not elaborate. Ojichukwu spoke for 6 minutes in the flat, precise voice she used when she was talking about something that mattered too much for performance, and what she said was about structures, about what it meant to build something that was actually what it claimed to be, that held the weight it was supposed to hold, that didn't have voids inside it where the critical material had been substituted for something cheaper. She was talking about buildings. Everyone in the room understood she was talking about more than buildings. Chidi sat in the front row with Kayamika beside him. He was less thin than he'd been in November. He had the look of a man who was still recalibrating, still learning how to be present in a life that had resumed without the full knowledge of whether resuming was something he deserved. Jianyu watched him from the back of the room and recognized it. He'd had his own version of that recalibration in different circumstances in different years. It didn't resolve quickly. It resolved the way most things resolved, slowly, through the accumulation of days that were ordinary and then weren't and then were again. Kayamika had a project table in the front corner of the center's main room. She had negotiated this with the center's programming director with the specific focused intensity she brought to everything, and the result was a dedicated workspace for what she was calling, at 8 years old, structural prototyping. She was building models of bridges. She had opinions about load distribution that she expressed with a directness that caused her teachers some difficulty, and her mother no difficulty at all. After the ceremony, Jianyu stood near the entrance and watched the room fill with the specific energy of a beginning. Children arriving and examining things. Adults talking. The center's staff opening the workshop areas one by one. He was wearing better shoes than he'd had on the night of the warehouse. His ribs had healed into 2 thin scars of bone that his doctor said he'd feel in cold weather for the rest of his life. He thought of them sometimes as a kind of annotation, a record of the night the dead phone had vibrated in his jacket pocket, and something inside him had shifted off the axis it had been fixed on for 22 years. Ojichukwu came and stood beside him. She stood with him the way people stand when they've been through something together that gave them permission to dispense with the architecture of casual proximity. Close, comfortable, no performance of it. You paid for half the renovation, she said. It was not a question. The foundation paid for it, he said. I contributed to the foundation. It's restructured syndicate assets, operates as a legitimate nonprofit with a publicly available financial record. He looked at the room. I had a lawyer review the entire structure. A legitimate lawyer. A very expensive one, which I understand to be the same thing. She made a sound that was the descendant of a laugh, the dry, compressed version of it, the sound of someone whose laugh had been through enough that it didn't always come out at full scale. Thank you, she said. You don't need to. I know I don't need to. She turned and looked at him with the direct gaze she'd been using on him since the night of the warehouse. The gaze that had no performance in it and no softening and no agenda except accuracy. I want to. Those are different things. He met the gaze. Outside the center's windows, the Jangnam district moved through its afternoon. A city that was, in increments, slowly becoming more itself. The buildings that had been condemned were coming down, and the spaces they left were being argued over by the people who lived around them, the way cities had always argued over the spaces left by things that fell. The Swayong building, she said. The first one I reported. It's on the demolition schedule for February. I know. I want to watch it come down. I know that too. She looked at him. Come with me. He looked at the center's main room, at Kayamika at her project table, already deep in the mechanics of a bridge model, her hands moving with the careful authority of someone who had been given a problem she found worth solving. At Chitty, in conversation with two of the center's staff, his posture slowly shedding the compressed quality of 4 years of caution, his hands beginning to move the way people's hands move when they're talking about something they believe in. At Jae-ho near the entrance, who had come because Jeon-yu had come, and who was presently eating a piece of ceremonial rice cake with the expression of a man who had made peace with the trajectory of events. At Ojichukwu beside him, the engineer, the woman who had stayed when she should have run, who had built traps inside traps, and had stood in a sealed penthouse and looked at the man who'd spent 2 years trying to erase her with the specific composure of someone who had been prepared for exactly this moment since before he knew her name. Yes, Jeon-yu said. I'll come. She nodded once. She looked back at the room. He looked at the room beside her. The afternoon light came in through the center's wide windows and fell across Kayamika's project table and the bridge she was building and the face of the girl who had sent 8 words into a dead phone in the middle of a rainstorm and had, in doing so, set in motion everything that followed. Not because she had planned it, not because she had understood the full scope of what she was doing, but because she had needed help and had known, with the absolute unquestioning certainty of a child who had been told one true thing and believed it, that the person on the other end of the line would come. She had been right. That was the whole story, and it was hers.